The bell tolls at midnight. Greetings. I'd like to welcome all of my midnight marauders. Come on in, get comfy, and lend me your imagination. It's 5 o'clock in the evening, and the sun is about to set in Crowtown. It's said that if you're a visitor or just passing through, just make sure you leave before it gets dark out. An exhausted Betty Morris woke at 6 in the morning, dragged herself up to a sitting position at the side of the bed, rubbed her tired eyes, headed to the kitchen and started cooking breakfast, knowing that her husband and daughter would be waking soon to the smell of honey ham and cinnamon pancakes. 15 minutes later, the kitchen table was set, and her husband Earl and daughter Nanji made their way into the kitchen where they sat and enjoyed breakfast together. "Thanks, honey. Everything looks delicious," Earl exclaims to Betty. "By the way, today some of the church members will be deep cleaning the inside of Holy King Tabernacle, so I'll be headed there after I drop Nanji off at school. The renovations are going well. I want you to come by after work and take a look around." "I'll see how I feel after work," Betty responded through an annoyed grin. Although Betty loved church, she hated attending Holy King Tabernacle. The women in the church treated her with a coldness that she could never understand. This was made even more ironic, being that she was First Lady and her husband Earl was pastor of the church. Every Sunday service, she found herself being side-eyed by the female attendees. On the other hand, they loved and admired Earl. Betty noticed that Nanji was sitting quietly at the table. Even though she had always been introverted and reserved, she'd joke with Betty from time to time, but today she had no words. "Everything all right, Nanji?" asked Betty. "Yeah, I'm fine," responded Nanji. "Are you excited about winning your 3rd gingerbread house contest this year? I'm sure you and your friends have something really creative planned this time," Betty exclaimed to Nanji, trying to pull positive energy from her daughter. "Well, I think I'm going to skip this year. I don't think my friends care much for it this time around," responded a despondent Nanji. Betty could sense her daughter's sadness at her friend's lack of support. "Finish up, sweetie. We gotta get going. I'll drop you off at school," said Earl. Betty stood at the door watching as Earl and Nanji got in the car. She smiled and waved to Nanji, who returned the gesture as the car pulled out of the driveway and up the road. Betty's wave turned into a stretch, and she rubbed her sore shoulders. She yawned, now looking as if she suffered an adrenaline dump and could fall asleep right there on the front porch. "I am so tired," Betty said to herself before heading back inside the house and closing the front door. Betty walked back into the bedroom, and as soon as her head touched the bed, she was fast asleep. Seemingly only moments later, Betty was awakened to the beeping of her alarm clock. Betty hit the clock that displayed 10 a.m., dragged herself up from the bed, and headed into the bathroom to prepare for her long day of work. After showering, Betty got dressed in her nursing uniform, grabbed her car keys, and left out the front door, and in no time was driving up the road to work. Betty worked the midday shift from 11 to 3 at Youthful Years Nursing Home, about 20 miles from her residence. It was quite the drive, but she learned to enjoy it as a way to decompress before dealing with the mentally and physically draining demands of her line of work. At work, an already exhausted Betty was in one of the elderly gentlemen's rooms tidying up when she heard a resident say, "Please be careful with my porcelain Labrador retriever. That's the only one I have left." Betty looked towards the door to see the resident, a tall, thin, well-kept, sophisticated, and kind gentleman with completely white hair and a black mustache named Mr. Tolbert. "Oh yes, Mr. Tolbert, it's still just as you left it. You're all set," Betty said with a smile as she squeezed past Mr. Tolbert, still standing in the doorway, and proceeded down the hallway to the next residence room to clean. Betty was headed to the next residence room when she heard a commotion toward the end of the hall. Face to face in a heated confrontation stood neighboring residents, Miss Collins and Miss Peters. Betty shook her head and exclaimed to herself, "Of course," as it was no surprise to her. Those two ladies were always fighting about everything. Whose afro was the neatest to who had a better speaking voice, who Mr. Tolbert fancied the most, and the list went on and on. Betty quickly walked down the hall to see what all the fuss was about, and found herself standing in the middle of hurls of insults and accusations coming from both ladies. Betty turned to Miss Collins to reason with her. "Please calm down and let's be rational," Betty said. Before Betty could get out another word, Miss Collins viciously retorted, "Look here, you busybody. Stop sticking your big nose where it doesn't belong." Surprisingly, Miss Peters also had words for Betty and exclaimed, "Yeah, just who do you think you are, Tubby?" In a moment of anger and shock, Betty's frustrations boiled over and she yelled, "Okay, just kill each other then. See if I give a damn. I'm so sick of you people, and I'm especially sick of this God-forsaken place." Everyone stopped and stared at Betty. You could hear a pin drop. Betty knew she had lost it for that split second, but couldn't take it back. Not knowing what to do, Betty stormed off to the break room. Whispers began to circulate around the nursing home, and the giggles and gossip became more apparent to Betty with each passing hour. Surprising to her, Betty felt pretty good about letting the two residents know how she felt due to the fact that they were always so rude to her. However, Betty began noticing an odd occurrence. Throughout the remainder of her shift, out of the corner of her eye, she kept seeing crow-like figures whenever she turned down a hall. The visions only lasted for a split second, but the figures seemed to be following her. Betty was exhausted and concluded that she must have been hallucinating and couldn't wait for her shift to end so she could get home and lie down in bed. Betty felt very uneasy for the rest of the day, but somehow had made it to the end of the work shift and was just getting ready to clock out when the head supervisor, Roger Meade, approached Betty in the break room and asked her to come talk to him briefly in his office. Betty pensively agreed. Mr. Meade was a serious and intimidating figure. His curt and cold demeanor earned him the nickname of Mr. Mean from the other workers. Betty felt that nothing good was going to come from this meeting with him in his office. All of the employees who worked on different floors were now near the supervisor's door, smiling, laughing, and whispering. For a split second, it appeared to Betty as though all of their faces began to morph into what looked like vicious crows, and the laughter sounded like squawking. Betty rubbed her exhausted eyes frantically, blinked, and looked again to see her nasty co-workers' faces return back to normal, but still just as ugly. Betty entered the office behind Mr. Meade. "Have a seat, Betty," Mr. Meade instructed. "What's this about?" Betty asked. Mr. Meade didn't answer. He just sat there staring at the booklet on his desk, checking and reading over a few things. After about 30 seconds, he looked up at Betty and said, "Today, did you report any incidents with two of our residents that occurred right before lunchtime?" He stared hard at Betty, his eyes popping through his bifocals and the huge vein protruding on the side of his left temple. "No, I didn't report it," Betty responded. Mr. Meade looked down at the chart booklet on his desk and back up at Betty. "Why?" he questioned. And Betty knew why. because she had snapped and said some pretty questionable things to both Miss Collins and Miss Peters, and some of the other nursing assistants heard everything and immediately went to report Betty. Mr. Meade looked into Betty's now water-filled eyes and asked, "Did you tell Miss Collins and Miss Peters?" And I quote, "Okay, kill each other then. See if I give a damn. I'm sick of you people and sick of this God-forsaken place. Did you say that, Mrs. Morris?" Betty noticed the use of her last name by Mr. Meade, who always called her Betty. Not a good sign. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Meade. I didn't mean any of what I said. I was just frustrated," Betty pleaded. "I understand, Mrs. Morris, but we've decided to give you some time off. This job can be very taxing, and we hope you'll get some much-needed R&R. We know how valuable rest is to our nursing staff, and we want you at your very best. I've already drawn up your leave of absence, and I'll be in contact with you soon." Mr. Meade explained to Betty, "Best of luck to you, Mrs. Morris." "But wait, Mr. Meade, I'm fine. I need the hours, please," Betty pleaded, but to no avail. Betty had gotten laid off. Betty sat in the parking lot watching her ex-co-workers leaving after work, laughing and overjoyed that Betty had gotten fired. After about 5 minutes of stewing in her own self-pity, Betty decided to start her Mercedes and proceeded to drive slowly down the road, leaving her independence behind for the first time in her adult life. So many thoughts go through Betty's head all at once, angry thoughts wondering which one of her mean and nasty co-workers had told Mr. Meade what happened. I bet it was Sandra Belle. She's always watching me and comparing herself to me. Betty remembered an encounter where she wore a nice white sweater to work, just to see Sandra wear a nearly identical sweater the next day. Only Sandra's sweater had a sparkly brooch on the collar that she couldn't wait to point out, snobbishly saying, "Hey Betty, look, we have matching sweaters today, but I found this beautiful brooch from the flea market. Isn't it just adorable?" Sandra stood there with this "I've one-upped you" look on her face. Betty forced a smile and said, "It's just lovely, Sandra. Will you excuse me? I can't keep Mr. Tolbert waiting on his coffee." Betty quickly walked down the hall away from Sandra's stifling energy, only to turn around and see what looked to be a giant crow with hollow black eyes glaring at her. Betty gasped, and with a blink, Sandra was standing there normal again with her freaking sparkling brooch, and quickly threw up a BS smile and waved at Betty. Betty steamed as she endured this type of behavior on a daily basis from a co-worker that looked just like her. But surprisingly, just as soon as these angry feelings came on, they began to fade, and a sudden feeling of freedom emerged as Betty realized that she would no longer have to deal with whispering amongst conniving co-workers while looking in her direction in the lunchroom as she sat quietly minding her own business, eating her leftovers from dinner the night before. No more comparing their clothing, hair length, acrylic nails, skin tone, weight or shape, car, or anything to hers. Hallelujah. Betty felt awesome. She turned on the car radio, and wouldn't you know, one of her absolute favorite songs by the Four Tops was playing. An oldie but goodie, so she sang along to the top of her lungs with the windows down and the sunroof open. Ain't no woman like the one I've got. Oh no, they don't come better. To make her happy doesn't take a lot. She don't ask for things. No diamond rings. She drove past Grady's Food and Liquor and decided to turn around and go inside. Today, she decided to treat herself to lunch and a cocktail before going home and breaking the news to Earl and Nanji. Betty parked in the back parking lot of the bar next to a large dumpster where no one could see her car. She prayed no one would try to break in it. She was just 30 minutes from her house and just planned on grabbing a quick drink and bite to eat, then heading home. Betty walked inside the back of Grady's. The vibe was surprisingly much darker than she expected. The lights were low, and the music that played was jazzy, but slightly ominous. Only two other patrons sat inside the establishment, a tall, lean, and statuesque woman with a very pointed chin, and a short, stout, and dark-skinned man with black, sunken eyes. They sat together at the bar, engrossed in a conversation. Together, they looked like quite the odd couple. Betty proceeded to tuck herself in a corner booth when an older, dark-complected man approached her and asked, "So what can I get you?" "What's your most popular sandwich here?" she responded, realizing that he was the server. "The barbecue rib sandwich," he said. "Okay, I'll have that," Betty excitedly responded. "And what would you like to drink?" he continued. "How about a strawberry daiquiri?" Betty requested. "Okay, one hot rib and strawberry daiquiri, about 10 minutes, okay?" he said. Betty nodded. The server walked away, and Betty noticed that he had a limp. "Betty, take your caregiving hat off. Just enjoy the moment." She reasserted herself. And so she did enjoy the moment. About 3 hours worth of it. The rib sandwich was so good she ordered a second one, and the fourth daiquiri was a blur. Before long, she sat in that corner booth with blurred vision. How could this have happened? Betty thought to herself. I don't even remember the drinks being strong. An inebriated Betty slurred. She tried to sit up as straight as she could, but found that lying her head on the cool table was much more relaxing. All of a sudden, she heard, "Ma'am, would you like to take care of your bill now?" Betty slowly sat up and grabbed what she thought was her purse, but realized it was her fanny pack with nothing but lip gloss and chewing gum inside. Through her anxious frustration, she had left her purse in her work locker and drove off without it. Her heart sank to the floor even more when she realized her phone was in her purse. There seems to be a little problem," slurred Betty. "You see..." But before she could get the slurred words out, a very deep, heavy, but feminine voice said, "My husband and I will take care of her tab and anything else she might want." Betty's eyes stared in the direction of the voice and realized it was the statuesque woman sitting with the short and stout man at the bar who she had identified as her husband. "Oh my God, thank you so much," said an embarrassed Betty. "I got fired today and I mistakenly left my purse in my work locker." Betty's focus was off because the couple seemed to both have black feathers sticking out from underneath their clothing and solid black eyes like two tiny pebbles of coal. "That's okay. Don't worry about it. We got you," said the statuesque woman. Betty rubbed her eyes and, though very dizzy, began to collect herself and attempted to stand up when all of a sudden the room began to spin and she could feel the effects of the barbecue sandwiches and drinks all trying to make an exit, so she asked for the location of the bathroom and the server quickly directed her to the area. She hurried to the restroom and entered the first stall to upchuck everything she had ingested. Getting drunk and throwing up in a dark bar, all while leaving her purse at a job she was just fired from, really had Betty down in the dumps. She flushed the toilet, staggered out of the bathroom stall, and made her way over to the sink where the statuesque lady was washing her hands. "Sweetheart, what's your name?" she asked Betty. "Betty," she replied, feeling totally ashamed and irresponsible. "If you can tell me where to send you back the money, I'd be happy to do so, I insist." "Please don't worry yourself, darling. We've just got to get you home," the statuesque lady retorted, looking at Betty with honest concern. "Oh, I can call my husband, Earl," Betty responded. "I wouldn't drive home like this. Absolutely not. My husband and I will drive you home, and you can come get your car tomorrow when you feel better. How's that? Said the statuesque woman. Oh no, I couldn't allow you to drive me home, said Betty. You've already been so kind. Please, Betty, I insist, pleaded the statuesque woman. Moved by the woman's honest concern and worry for Betty, she agreed to the ride from the nice strangers. The couple couldn't have been sweeter and made her feel so safe. On the way to the car, Betty noticed that the stout man seemed to walk with a limp similar to that of the server at the bar. The statuesque woman gently held Betty's arm and walked her out to a black Lincoln Continental parked near the entrance of the back parking lot. Betty thought to herself, I hadn't seen this car here upon my arrival, but I also thought I had my purse and phone with me too. Go figure. The stout man opened the car door and Betty slid in the back seat and noticed she couldn't see out of the windows from inside the car. However, the back seat was so comfortable and seemed to lull her into a dream state. Before long, she found herself drifting off into a warm and cozy sleep. Betty awakened to the sound of what seemed to be an old Soul Train episode. She could hear the voice of Don Cornelius introducing the legendary Mr. Al Green, as he put it. Suddenly, she heard the organ of a very familiar soul tune begin before the vocals that went, Love and happiness, something that will make you do right, make you do wrong. Betty's head felt as though it was splitting in half. She felt as if she had been drugged. Her awareness slowly returned to her, and she suddenly realized that she was sitting in a dark room, reclined on a lazy boy chair with her arms zip-tied in the front and a piece of tape over her mouth. She immediately tried to scream but could only produce a muffled grunt. The panicked effort caused her head to throb. Where is this place? She thought to herself as she frantically looked around the room, shaking in fear. Her eyes locked on a filthy-looking bed. What she saw under the bed caused a sense of dread. Glowing eyes whispering, calling her name.
Betty. 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 Betty.
All Betty could do was stare back at the glowing eyes staring at her and pray that God would protect her from whatever was calling her from underneath the bed. With bated breath, she closed her eyes, and when she reopened them, the eyes were gone, and she no longer heard her name being called. Tears ran down Betty's face as she felt so stupid for trusting that hideous couple and putting herself in harm's way. All she could remember was that monstrous couple driving her home, but this was by no means her beautiful home, with the lovely bedroom she spent 6 months decorating herself. Betty cried uncontrollably. She began to carefully examine the room while keeping her focus under the bed. The room was dank and musty, with an old-fashioned television with an antenna sticking out of the top of it, and piles of what looks like crow poop dried all over the floor. There was that twin bed in the corner of the room with a crochet purple blanket spread over it, with unearthly occurrences going on underneath it. A yellow beanbag chair sat in the other far corner of the room, a can of Afro Sheen on an old beat-up-looking brown dresser, and Essence magazine spread out on a small table next to it. Betty's heart was beating so fast all she could do was cry and try to remember exactly what happened to her. Then it dawned on her, she knew the drinks she had at Grady's bar couldn't have been strong enough on their own to make her pass out, so something had to be in one of them to do it. The drinks were spiked. She tried standing on her feet but lost her balance and went tumbling face first onto this matted yellow carpet that smelled like crap. She winced in pain, having twisted her ankle, and realized that her ankles had also been zip-tied together and she was completely immobile. Lying there in agony, she heard footsteps coming up to the room door. As the door slowly creaked open, a boy small in stature peeked his head in to see her on the floor crying. "She's awake!" the boy yelled. "Please help me," Betty started to mumble, but the boy just stood there. Suddenly, a rather large woman in a green turtleneck, some red polyester bell-bottoms pants, and platform shoes with the driest afro Betty ever seen sternly said, "Listen, if you start to make trouble, I'll finish it." Betty lied there, shocked and bewildered. This woman had just threatened her with bodily harm, or at least that's what her deep, thick vocals sounded like. The large woman barged into the room and seemed to scoop Betty up with one hand and toss her back in the lazy boy chair as if she only weighed approximately 10 pounds. Boy, was she strong, thought a terrified Betty. She began to frantically mumble without making any movements so the large woman wouldn't finish it like she had just threatened to do. She looked at Betty with a stone face and proceeded to rip the tape off of her mouth with one swipe. "Please, please tell me where I am, ma'am," begged Betty. The large woman looked at Betty and said, "Baby, you in Crowtown," and slammed the door shut before Betty could ask why she was tied up and what they planned to do with her. Betty began to feel faint and on the verge of losing consciousness. Her focus became to concentrate on staying conscious while the Pointer Sisters played on this raggedy black and white television. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the creaky door slowly opened again, and a small crow hopped into the room, squawking. The small crow made its way over to a terrified Betty and began to peck at the zip ties around Betty's ankles until they broke. The small crow then jumped in her lap and started pecking away at the plastic zip ties around her wrists until they also broke. If she hadn't seen this with her own 2 eyes, she'd never have believed it. After pecking the zip ties loose, the little crow jumped down to the floor from Betty's lap and looked her in the eyes before turning its head to the open door as if to say, "Follow me." It hopped back to the open door and looked back at Betty as she rose from the chair and began following it down a brightly lit hallway with sun rays shining through every crack in this old-fashioned house with decor right out a 1970s nightmare, down the front stairs and out of the front door of the house. All Betty could see was crows congregating everywhere. Sensing her presence, the crows all turned at once and focused their attention on her. She froze with fear and an ice-cold chill ran down her spine, realizing that she had been led right into the thick of it. Suddenly, a huge black crow came flying from out of nowhere towards Betty at full speed, straight toward her face, and pecked her in the eye. Betty let out a blood-curdling scream as blood dripped down her face from her injured eye. Within seconds, the murder of crows swarmed her, pecking her everywhere on her body, leaving deep, bloody wounds all over her. Disoriented and blinded in one eye, Betty waved her hands around wildly as she attempted to fight off the bloodthirsty, squawking crows. Determined to survive, Betty tried to focus herself and began frantically looking around for any exit from this house of horrors. She got a sudden burst of adrenaline upon spotting a dirty old 10-speed bike leaned up against a tree near a heavily wooded area just yards from the house. She ran towards the tree and snatched the bike, hopped on it, and started to pedal. She prayed that she could outpace the crows on the bike, but they were vicious and determined in their attack and continued to pursue her. It didn't help that the back tire was nearly flat and on the verge of tearing at any moment. Betty's worst fear came true as the back tire of the bike finally gave way, causing the bike to wiggle out of control. The bike tumbled, and so did Betty with it. Determined to not avoid being bird-feed, Betty broke into an all-out sprint down the road and away from the crows, leaving a blood trail behind her from her wounds. She found herself breaking from the road and into the woods. Finally, there was silence and not a crow in sight. She was thankful for the slight reprieve from the crow's attack, but still knew that she had to find a way back to civilization. "I have to get out of this place. Lord, help me," cried Betty. The sun was about to set, and the wind started howling strong, as if the devil himself was about to make an appearance. All she could think about was Nanji and Earl, and would she ever be able to see them again? Dusk began to fall as she staggered through the woods, her legs feeling weak. As she began to gather her thoughts to figure out her next move, the squawk of a crow caused her to jump and shudder in terror. Then suddenly, another squawk, then another, and another. Betty looked around in search of where the sound was originating from when her eyes locked on a giant oak tree in the middle of the woods. Slowly, one by one, small glowing eyes began to light up the tree, and the squawking became constant as Betty now realized that what seemed to be leaves blowing with the wind were actually dozens and dozens of crows flapping their wings. Betty was in full panic and heaving so hard that her chest felt inflated. Her head was throbbing. Blood dripped from every wound on her body, and she only had vision in one eye. Betty began witnessing something that could stop your heart. The crow's feathers began falling off with each flap, gathered under the big oak tree. The crows themselves began to drop from the tree and unbelievably transform into humans. Betty noticed one of the crows limping as it hopped away from the tree and unmistakably began to closely resemble the server at Grady's bar as it transformed into a human. The biggest crow dropped from the tree last, the same one that pecked her eye. It slowly began to transform into the large lady from the house. Betty was beside herself as they all changed into human form, people that she'd never seen before. She was in total disbelief as she watched these crows twist and bend as their bodies shedded their crow form and turned into humans right in front of her. Suddenly, she felt someone near and turned in terror only to witness a little boy changing from a crow back to human form. His neck crackled and twisted. His beak fell off of his face like a caterpillar shedding its cocoon. The little boy walked over to her and said, "Sorry, lady. I tried to help you by pecking off your ankle and wrist ties, but I guess it was too late." Betty stood there in shock, shaking as he walked closer and pointed at her legs. Betty looked down, and much to her horror, all she saw were crow feet, and not the kind that collect near the outer corner of your eyes when you reach a certain age. Oh no, feet like that of a squawking black bird that is correlated with death and bad omens in most cultures. Betty's legs began to contort and change as she screamed in pain. Then feathers began sprouting out of every pore. Betty, crazed and irreversibly damaged yet totally aware of her surroundings and the situation taking place, opened her mouth to scream in terror but could only squawk. "She's over here," the boy yelled. All of the humans gathered around, including the couple and server from the bar, to see the newest addition to their own entrapment. Betty felt just like a crab in a barrel. The large woman made her way over, looked at Betty and said, "Those who don't leave by sundown on their first night are forever doomed to change into a crow every day thereafter for the rest of their miserable life without feeling any desire in the future to ever want to leave or get out. You one of us now." There she was, the former wife and mom, the former nursing assistant, a former regular human being who only wanted to be free from these pesky crows. Now she will be forever known as just another crow, forever lost in Crowtown.